Darkcast Network. Come to the dark side of podcasts. We have cookies.
Cookies? Me love cookies.
Hi, this is Kelly.
And this is Jenna.
We're the hosts of ODFM.
That's one from murder.
Each week, we discuss a true crime murder case
and intertwine our unique sense of dark humor.
Each episode relates to a word starting with the letter D.
The stories we tell are serious and true. Our opinions are not.
But be warned, we don't hold back on the details of the case.
Or our inappropriate comments and colorful language.
Join us every Monday on your favorite podcast provider for a new episode of ODFM.
We're on a full ride scholarship to hell.
Hey, swearing is foul language, and I like it. Listen at your own discretion. Hey there, Rainbow Warriors, and welcome to Beyond the Rainbow, True Crimes of the LGBTQ+. I'm your animal-loving host, CJ. You know, I had 2 great reviews in March, and I don't believe I acknowledged them because, frankly, I think I just found them. So let me give a shout out to Wineruino, who said, I just came across this podcast and love it. I love the narration and the witty commentary. It's great to have a show dedicated to the LGBTQ community that spotlights the injustices our community faces. Happy to be a rainbow warrior with you, CJ. Now, I might have mentioned this review before, but in case I haven't, I sure don't want to slight you, my friend. The other is from McLafsky, and it said, love this podcast. Great content and so respectful. Enjoy listening. Thank you so much, Rainbow Warriors, for the kudos. Our missing but not forgotten LGBTQ+ person this episode comes to us from my friend Jasmine. Jasmine is the incredible host of Hands Off My podcast. If you haven't listened to her show before, I highly recommend it. She sent this missing person via DMs on Instagram a couple weeks ago or so. But now, unfortunately, that I'm getting to this missing person, I have found that he is believed to have been murdered. The man, 31-year-old Andy Tench from Belmont, North Carolina, told his family that he was going to head into the city of Charlotte, and this would be for his 31st birthday. Charlotte was only about a 20-minute drive from his home. Andy was last seen at an LGBTQ+ friendly bar called The Bar at 316 on March 25th. It was around 12:30 a.m. His birthday was March 24th, and that evening is when he arrived in Charlotte. Andy's car was spotted later, March 25th, around 10:30 p.m. in Monroe, which is also in North Carolina. It's about a half an hour drive from Charlotte, and even though it was spotted, it was never stopped. But it was found the very next day on March 26th, abandoned in Monroe, around 3 a.m., and it had its hazard lights on. After Andy's disappearance, his credit card had been used at a Target store. Law enforcement tracked down the time and day his card was used, and it led him to surveillance footage. And it also led them to a suspect. So when I was writing this piece, it was on April 12th, and that's the date that this information came out on the media about Andy being deceased. 26-year-old Deshaun Robinson is who took Andy's car, and he was the one that was seen using his credit card in Target. He said Andy just died and he panicked and dumped Andy in the trash. Deshaun has been arrested, but only a few charges so far have been applied against him. Those charges are concealment of a death and some identity theft charges. And Andy's phone was found inside Deshaun's home. Because this case is so new, there's really not too much more to know yet. But seriously, if someone just dies on you, like, say it was during sex and being choked out. You don't just dump them in the fucking trash like garbage. What the hell is wrong with people who do that? I'll try to keep some tabs on this case and see how it plays out. But for now, rest in power, Andy. Yes, warriors, it's time for another serial killer of gay men. My friend Mill from The Cold Truth, which is no longer a podcast, but rather now a YouTube show, she wanted me to cover this case years ago, but I was never really feeling it. Why now, you might ask? Well, it seems this serial killer who operated in the 1980s and 90s is still making news even now in 2024. And the reason for this is yet another of his victims got his name back, and there are still more victims that need to be identified. Herbert Richard Baumeister, who went by Herb Baumeister, doesn't that sound like a beer? Yeah, I'll take a Herb Baumeister light on tap, please. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but it sounds like one to me. Herb was born April 7, 1947 in Indianapolis, Indiana. This would make him an Aries. Herb was the eldest of 4 siblings and had a rather normal childhood. He had both of his parents and his father was a doctor. In his adolescence, he began displaying antisocial behavior, including this weird fascination with golden showers. Yep, I said it. Herb was curious and wondered aloud what human urine would taste like. And I would say, dude, pee in a cup and take a swig, and then you will not be wondering anymore. But I can't be certain he actually tried that, as Herb once peed all over a teacher's desk at school. He also really loved playing with dead animals, and he had put a dead crow on another teacher's desk. I personally think my teaching career probably would have been over if Herb had been one of my students. Now, come on, though. If your kid is experiencing notions such as this, get him to fucking therapy. Something's not right there. It would seem like the only one in Herb's family who noticed his oddness was his father. His father did take him in for a psychiatric examination, and Herb was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and an antisocial disorder, which was great. They had labels for what Herb was experiencing. But after the diagnoses, that was it. No continued therapy, no medication, nothing. Herb was left to his own devices. Since the high school that Herb went to was mostly all about sports and athletics, Herb didn't fit in at all. He spent most of his free time as a loner. After high school, he enrolled in Indiana State University in 1965, but he dropped out after the first semester. Herb was trying to find his way in the world, and he was just as awkward as ever. He did enroll again in college in 1967. By 1971 at college, he met and married Juliana Sater. She went by Julie. They had met in one of their classes at college, and the two bonded over similar political views. And I guess during the marriage with Julie, Herb would go in and out of weird mood swings. And Julie would talk to Herb's dad about it. So Herb's dad, the doctor, finally decided to have Herb committed to a mental institution. This was about 6 months into their marriage. Herb stayed there for 2 months. Julie stuck by Herb the whole way, and she quietly said he was just hurting and he needed some help. Julie was a part-time student, and she worked part-time as a journalism teacher at a local high school. Now I'm going to switch gears just a little bit, and I'm going to talk about at least a dozen young men that had disappeared and turned up along the side roads in Indianapolis in the 1980s. 15-year-old Michael Petrie was reported missing June 7, 1980. He'd been seen riding around in a stranger's car on June 10th. Michael engaged in survival sex, and he mostly hung out around gay bars. By June 16th, his naked body was found strangled to death in rural Hamilton County. 23-year-old Maurice Taylor's shirtless body was found July 1982, also in rural Hamilton County. Maurice lived a nomadic lifestyle, and he often hung around gay bars in order to make money, selling sex to gay men. The coroners were not 100% sure of Maurice's cause of death, but they did believe he too had been strangled. It took 8 months to identify Maurice because his mother was a patient in a mental hospital and she wasn't able to file a missing report on her son. Delvoyd Baker was a 14-year-old boy whose body was found partially naked near a river in Hamilton County on October 3, 1982. He had been strangled. Delvoyd had called his parents from a payphone at 10:30 p.m. on October 2nd. He told his parents that he and a friend were going to go see a movie and he'd be home afterwards. But Delvoyd actually rode his bike to where the gay bars were in Indianapolis, and he solicited sex from men to make some extra money. Can you imagine being 14 years old and knowing you could score cash by selling your body? It just kind of blows my mind. And it sounded like Delvoyd came from a decent family that really cared about him, especially if he was calling home to check in. It's just very sad to me. May 28th of 1983, 22-year-old Michael Riley was last seen leaving a gay nightclub in Indianapolis. The venue was called the Vogue Theater, and Michael wasn't leaving alone. He was leaving with an unidentified man. His naked body was found in a ditch in Hancock County on June 5th. He too had been strangled. By now, with 4 young men, possibly all gay, murdered in 3 years, law enforcement had to know that there was a serial killer on their hands. But if they did know, they weren't saying anything yet. 17-year-old Eric Roediger disappeared May 7, 1985. His body was discovered several days later, shirtless and near a stream in Preble, Ohio. Eric had been strangled to death. So now we have a little different scenario where the victim was placed in another state. And Eric's family denied Eric was gay or even had gay tendencies. Eric, who lived in Indiana, was actually waiting for a bus to take for some interviews he had for his summer job. But instead, someone with a car pulled up to the bus stop and offered Eric a ride, which Eric accepted. 29-year-old Michael Glenn's body was found clad only in his underwear in August of 1986, and this was just outside of Eaton, Ohio. Okay, this is when I had to go look at a map of the United States. It looks like Indianapolis is pretty much smack dab in the center of Indiana. And it seems like a pretty short distance between Ohio and Illinois state lines from Indianapolis. Michael had been strangled, and his remains were not identified until 1989, 3 years later, using fingerprints. But I don't understand why they couldn't determine his identity sooner, since it was only fingerprints and not genetic DNA being used. I just don't get that. Maybe it had something to do with Michael's fingerprints not being in any database system? I don't know. If you care to shoot me a guess, I'd love to hear it. By now, there were whispers of a serial killer out and about. This killer was given the moniker the I-70 Strangler. As the location of all 12 bodies, they were found off the Interstate 70 highway. James Robbins was a 21-year-old who went missing October 15, 1987. This was after he left his mom's house around 10 p.m. His naked body was located in a ditch 2 days later off the I-70 near Gwynville, Indiana. He too had been strangled. Jean-Paul Talbot's naked strangled body was found near a stream in Defiance County, Ohio. I looked, but I couldn't find this victim's age. 26-year-old Stephen Elliott's body was found dressed only in his underwear in Preble County, Ohio. This was in August of 1989. He had been strangled with a ligature, most likely a rope. His father had told police when Stephen came out in 1979 at the age of 16, he left his family home. Or was he kicked out? His father said that after that, Stephen developed an alcohol addiction, and he became a male sex worker. It was survival sex, I'm sure. Clay Boatman was a 32-year-old registered nurse who lived in Richmond, Indiana. He disappeared in August of 1990 on his way to a gay club. His strangled body was found in a ditch by a group of kids in Eaton, Ohio. By the way, Clay's family denied Clay was homosexual. 19-year-old Thomas Clevenger Jr. disappeared the end of August 1990. Thomas lived a somewhat troubled life. As a young child, he started to drink alcohol and commit petty crimes. At the age of 14, he stabbed the assistant principal of his school. It was at this time he was diagnosed with having an intellectual disability because he couldn't read or write. Months before his mostly nude, strangled body was found in Eaton, Ohio, Thomas had taken to hanging out in front of gay clubs and selling his body for sexual favors, which is a fact that Thomas's mom and sister deny. That seems like a lot of denial going on in this state. The last known victim of the I-70 strangler was Otto Becker. He was 42. His strangled body was found in a ditch in Henry County, Indiana. And even though I say Otto was the last known victim, there were actually 4 others between the years of 1981 and 1983. These men were all gay men who were out at gay bars in Indiana. Eventually, they were removed from the list of the I-70 serial killers tally. I'm not sure why, but maybe they were found to have been murdered by someone else. By now, you're probably wondering if I've become senile. Because, CJ, we're supposed to be talking about Herb Baumeister. Herb Light, the brewski, remember? Yes, my colorful, fancy friends, I remember. I only bring all this up because Herb is suspected of being the I-70 strangler. But to this day, the I-70 stranglers' cases remain cold. And law enforcement can only make shot-in-the-dark guesses as to who the I-70 strangler really is. It's possible serial killer Larry Eiler killed some of these men. I covered Larry Eiler back in Season 12, Episode 6. He was known as simply the Interstate Killer, and he confessed to murdering 21 young men between 1982 and 1984. Larry Eiler operated in the Indiana and Illinois area. It's possible Larry did take some of the lives credited to the I-70 strangler, and he just didn't admit it publicly, I suppose. However, police still feel strongly that Herb was the I-70 strangler. And part of that suspicion is because a photo was found taken at the Vogue Theater, that gay club I mentioned that the third suspected victim of the I-70 strangler, Michael Riley, he was at. And that picture showed Herb with Michael Riley. In 1985, Herb was working at the Department of Motor Vehicles. His co-workers did not like him. They found him to be pushy, rude, and have zero filters. And someone at his work had peed all over a manager's desk. Rumors were that it was Herb, and I'll just bet those rumors were true. As a result, Herb was fired from the Department of Motor Vehicles. Stepping back a few years to 1979, Herb and Julie started to create a family. And once the kids started to come, Julie had become a full-time mom until Herb was fired from the Department of Motor Vehicles. And then Julie had to become the breadwinner. And Herb was a stay-at-home dad because he was having a lot of troubles finding work. Herb finally found something he loved doing when he accepted a job at a thrift store. I think in the UK they might be called charity stores. Essentially, a thrift store is a store where used goods that people donate are sold. I think the biggest one we have here in the United States is probably Goodwill Industries. Herb loved this concept so much, and he learned how the operation worked. He convinced Julie they would open one of their own. So the couple purchased or rented a storefront, and they opened Save-A-Lot thrift store in Indianapolis. The first store was so successful, Herb was able to open a second location of their Save-A-Lot thrift stores. By 1991, with the success of their businesses, Herb and his wife Julie purchased a Tudor-style mansion that came complete with a 1,200 square foot apartment above the garage. and an indoor swimming pool in the basement. The home was set upon 18 acres and it was called Fox Hollow Farms. From the outside looking in, this was the epitome of the perfect American family. A loving husband, a doting wife with 3 children. They had a successful family business and a huge home with quite a bit of property. But on the inside looking out, while the lifestyle might have felt right to Herb, it was anything but right for Julie. From her point of view, in all the years her and Herb were married, they had sex a whopping total of 6 times. 3 of those encounters would have been to conceive their children. Once was most likely their wedding night, and the other 2 times were probably attempts at trying to conceive. Now, while Herb was not a very attentive husband, he was a pretty good dad from my understanding. But as an employer, he sounded like a nightmare boss. One of those bosses who micromanage everything. And he had those horrible mood swings with his workers. Oftentimes, the treatment of Herb's employees would also be used on his wife Julie at home. Julie really had no one to talk to about Herb's erratic behavior, no one that really understood. The only one she had would have been Herb's dad, but he passed away a couple years earlier. So Julie would find excuses to take the kids and leave home whenever she could. She'd often take the kids to visit friends, relatives, and sometimes it'd be for several days or longer. And during these times, Herb, to blow off steam, would find himself a gay bar in the city. Because steam was not the only thing Herb wanted to blow. He would introduce himself as Brian Smart to a young gay man he found attractive at a bar. The backstory he would give his victims was that he was a caretaker of an 18-acre farm. His employer was away and he had free range over the whole place. Would you like to come back to my employer's place with me and take a swim in my employer's indoor pool? By 1993, Herb seemed to really be spiraling with his crimes, as more and more young gay men were disappearing from Indianapolis gay bars. But here's the thing, the men were vanishing. But where were they or their bodies if they'd been murdered? May 28, 1993, 20-year-old Johnny Bear went missing from Indianapolis. July 6, 1993, Jeff Jones, who was 31, went missing too. July 31st, 1993, a 20-year-old named Richard Hamilton disappeared. 27-year-old Alan Livingstone poofed into thin air on August 6, 1993, as did 34-year-old Manuel Resendez the very same night. 24-year-old Alan Broussard also went missing on June 6, 1994. Roger Goodlett, who was 33, disappeared July 22, 1994, after he visited a gay bar. Roger, by the way, was seen in the company of Herb 2 weeks prior to his disappearance. The 2 men were at some gay establishments in Indianapolis, and witnesses remembered them. Mike Kieran, a 45-year-old gay man, went missing after going to a gay bar in downtown Indianapolis on March 31, 1995. August 8, 1995, 34-year-old Jerry Williams Cummer went missing. And even though law enforcement suspect he was one of Herb's victims, he could have fallen victim to someone or something else. He or any part of his remains have yet to be discovered. His car was found abandoned at Castleton Square Mall. When Herb would get his young gay man to his house, he'd take him right to the basement swimming pool as promised. He would usually be the first one in the pool, and then he'd wait for his victim to join him. A sexual encounter would usually occur, and then Herb would get his victim into a vulnerable spot, and he'd murder him. Perhaps he'd get behind his victim and strangle him. In 1993, while running through the woods, Herb's now 13-year-old son found a human skull on the Fox Hollow Farms property. He put it on the end of a stick, as, kids do, and he marched it to his mom. His mom kind of flipped out, and she asked Herb, "What the hell is this?" Herb explained it away as being from his dad's skeletal collection he had. After all, his dad was a doctor. What Herb failed to explain away was how the hell it got into the woods on a property Herb's dad never even visited. In 1994, a gay man named Tony Harris, who was good friends with the missing victim Roger Goodlett, he met a man who called himself Brian Smart at a gay nightclub. The man invited him to his employer's home for a swim. Tony said he'd go if he could ride there with Brian. Brian said he'd prefer Tony to bring his own car, but Tony declined. Brian finally agreed to take Tony. Tony figured if he left his car at the bar and anything happened to him, at least people would find his car and start looking for him. Tony and Brian. Oh, come on, I don't have to play that game with you guys. It's Herb and we all know it. Tony and Herb got back to his place. They got into the pool, and they engaged in sex. At one point, Herb tried to strangle Tony as part of erotic asphyxiation, but Tony fought him off, and he escaped from Herb's farm. After escaping with his life, Tony contacted law enforcement, and he told them that he knew who murdered his friend Roger Goodlett, and he proceeded to tell the police about Brian Smart. But police were unable to locate any Brian Smart in the area, or any Brian Smart in neighboring areas. Tony saw Brian Smart again about a year later while he was driving. Tony followed the car that Herb was in, and he took the information to the police. They were able to identify Brian Smart as Herbert Baumeister. Detectives approached Herb at his residence, and they named him as a suspect in the disappearance of several men in the area. They also asked to search his property, but neither Herb or Julie would grant permission for them to do so. In 1996, growing ever so tired of Herb's erratic behavior, Julie began the process of filing for a divorce from Herb. And in June of 1996, a search of Herb's Fox Hollow Farms property was conducted while he was away on vacation. Julie gave the police a go-ahead to search the property. That search uncovered thousands of bones from the acreage around the home. In fact, police were able to assemble 11 male bodies and identify 8 of them. Vacation or not, a warrant was put out for Herb's arrest. Learning of this, Herb fled to Canada. In a park in Ontario, 49-year-old Herb took a .357 Magnum pistol, and he shot himself in the head on July 3, 1996. He left a 3-page suicide letter apologizing for the mess in the park, saying he went to another park, but there were too many kids around, and that his last meal was a peanut butter sandwich. Not one iota of a mention about any of the lives he had taken. But yet it took 3 pages to just say the other nonsense. He must have wrote the words in very large letters. Over the years, more and more bones have been found on the Fox Hollow Farms property. As of January of this year, 2024, victim Manuel Resendez was the one who was able to be identified and get his name back. And in October of last year, Alan Livingston got his name back. There are still at least 10,000 bones and bone fragments that were found at the Fox Hollow property, and they're waiting for identification. Also, at least 20 more families of missing victims have come forward, and they've volunteered their DNA to try and identify their missing loved ones. In the early 2000s, knowing the history behind Fox Hollow Farms, Vicki and Rob Graves purchased the property. The Tudor mansion was in desperate need of many expensive repairs, and the property itself was a ton to upkeep. But they went ahead and they bought it, and they moved themselves and their family in. And the reason I'm telling you about these folks, there's been a ton of paranormal type occurrences happening in and around the home and the property. Vicki, who's a scientist and not a huge believer of ghosts and spirits, saw the apparition of a young man in a bright red t-shirt and blue jeans walking near one side of their forest. When she focused her eyes to get a better look, the young man's legs were transparent and he just disappeared into the woods. She didn't see him just once, but twice. A single guy named Joe that Rob worked with was having difficulty finding a place to live. So Rob invited Joe to come live in the apartment above the garage at Fox Hollow Farms. But of course, Rob told Joe about the history of the place first. Joe thought it was a great spot, even with its dark past, and he moved in. Many nights Joe's sleep would be interrupted by knocking at the door. When Joe would get up to see who the hell was knocking at his door at 3 a.m., no one would be there. Joe, too, would see apparitions of young men. He even saw the same one that Vicki had seen, the guy in the bright red t-shirt and blue jeans. One day, Joe was swimming in the basement pool with Vicki and Rob's kids. Joe went underwater, and then he came up and he was leaning against the pool. All of a sudden, he felt something like hands around his neck. He turned quickly to see what there was, but nothing was there. So he swam back under the water, and again something was tightening around his neck. Scared, he fought his way back up to the top of the water, gasping for air. When he broke the surface, there was no longer any tightness around his neck. Over the past years, paranormal specialists, shamans, spiritual guiders, etc., they have visited Vicki and Rob's place to try and explain some of the phenomenons occurring there. A shaman had said that his people who have passed over there on the property, they are displeased over the poor treatment that the land has received through the years. The cast and crew of Ghost Adventures, and yes, even Zach Bagans himself did a segment at Vicki and Rob's place. Now, I am not one to recommend Ghost Adventurers. I think they're kind of dumb and way over the top dramatic. But they too had some experiences right from the get-go at Fox Hollow Farms. Because, of course they did. Bring in ghost hunters and I'd be much more apt to believe it. I did check out an audiobook from my library called The Horrors of Fox Hollow Farms. And it tells all about the ghostly encounters experienced at Herb's old place. I think Vicki and Rob eventually sold the place, or at least some of it. A winery owner purchased 8 acres of it, and he was looking to build a home there for his family, and to also sell 3 lots next to it in 2019. This was a little longer of an episode this time, because there was just so much to talk about. So I think I'm going to forego the True Crime Quickie this time. Rest in power to all of Herb's victims. Love you, Rainbow Warriors. You matter. And remember, it's not a crime to be gay. Unless you're a murderer.